Brubacher, one of the things that I have just admired so much about you is just, it seems like when we look at the research for forensic interviewing, you have looked at and really examined and done research on just a wide swath of different areas of the forensic interviewing. And so what brought you to this work and this focus on interviewing?
Well, that's a great question. It wasn't something that I really started intentionally. I had the opportunity to work in someone's lab. My former advisor went on parental leave, and I took over her lab for a year and just, worked full time. And she was working on children in the law. And I became interested. This was after I finished my undergraduate. I became interested in that, and I wanted to follow it further. So she suggested I do a master's with her, and I hadn't really intended to go that route. So I stayed and did a master's, and I was starting to get a little bit hooked in at that point, and we were starting to do some work with frontline interviewers and training, and I really enjoyed being able to have that connection between research and practice. So I stayed on to do a PhD. Still being unsure where this was going to take me. But through those PhD years, I really developed a lot of connections internationally, really, with interviewers and other, frontline professionals who worked with children. And at that time, then I decided to stay on with it. And then I did some work with Michael Lamb during that PhD, where I got to go to the UK and see some of the interviews firsthand.
Okay.
That was in 2010. So that was really the point, I think, at which that career path became set. That I spent only 6 months in the UK with Michael, although I continued to collaborate with him from there on. But that was probably the pivotal moment. And then I did a postdoc with Deb Poole, who, as you know, was involved in the drafting of the Michigan State Protocol and the Maine. And so by that point, I was so far invested, and I was enjoying it so much that I continued on in this field from there.
Well, from your unique perspective as a researcher, and then the connections that you forged and just the different work that you've done, what do you see as some of the bigger challenges for forensic interviewers?
Well, I mean, I think there's some of the main challenges involve just the growing body of research and the ability to digest that all and manage it. And then at the same time, there's big gaps in our knowledge and understanding. There are, more and more people are working in the space of adolescents because we know that there hasn't been as much work done, especially with adolescents as witnesses and victims. So despite the fact that there's so much research and it's so much to process, there's still so much that needs to be done. And then children and young people's challenges are changing over time. And so there's new research that needs to address new issues that weren't there before, and the research process is slow, right? There's peer review, and there's the data collection. There's all this time. It can be a few years from the time somebody says, we really need to look at this, sexting issue, to the time that there is any kind of guidance produced. And even that guidance is often more preliminary than we might want it to be. We might feel as, scientists and researchers that this needs to be replicated and tested a dozen times. Meanwhile,
we're in the field
yeah, and so it's a delicate balance to make sure that we're also doing no harm. So we're providing some recommendations, but they're tentative, and you all have your own experience and tools to bring to that research and to say, okay, how does this fit with what I'm dealing with? So I do think those are big issues. I also, and this may apply less to interviewers at NCAC or in children's advocacy centers, but we see a lot of organizational problems, right? Yeah. Organizations are often not optimized for interviewers to continue to do good interviewing.
True.
We spent 20 or 30 years, and not all of it me, but developing, like, what should we train them? What do they need to know? What do they need to do? And then in the last 10 years or so, particularly with Martine Powell, looking at how best to train it. We know what we need to teach them. How do we get it in that it's working and that they're sustaining their skills? And now we're having really good interviewers coming out of training who are losing skills over time, not because they didn't learn it, but because their organization is either sending people away, like they're done their maximum tenure, or their organization says to them, oh, that's great, that's nice, but can you just go in there and ask, like, who it was and how old they were, and like just ask these questions because we need to get on with it. You know, and that is a problem. You have interviewers who can demonstrate the skills, even 6 months, a year out of training, they can demonstrate in a role play that they have all of those skills and they can do it. But if their team or their prosecution or their MDT or their police service or whatever is providing a different message and a different environment, and those are their organizational constraints that they have to work in.
That's true. We had someone in training 2 weeks ago said to Kim and I that, well, I know we're supposed to do narrative practice, but our team doesn't like it. And they think it's a waste of time, so we don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, I'm about ready to either eat my fingernails or pull my hair out. It's like, well, say some more. But we do see that. And, you know, what we try to say is when interviewers have come through their first protocol training and they leave, you've graduated from kindergarten. This is the beginning of your journey, and you have just the barest bit of foundational knowledge. But there's so much more that you have to do to internalize those skills, develop those skills, keep, as you said, abreast of all of the research and thinking about how that applies. And what we are seeing on our end often is that organization that they're not given time for self-review. They're not given time to work with a supervisor if they even have access to a supervisor. So it's like it's a one and done. And we know that it just takes so much more work.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about what you were saying about your presentation this morning. So you're looking at rapport, interview instructions, and the guideline, well, interview instructions and the guideline, and then narrative practice. And so if I was a new interviewer and I'd been trained a year ago, what would you say to me about the importance of those three pieces?
Yeah, and those are pieces that people often want to skip and get to the main part. I think that when they're done well, they can pay off so much in terms of a child feeling more comfortable. It's even at worst just simply a time for the child to sit in that chair for 5 or 10 minutes and breathe, check out the room, check out the interviewer. Like, is this somebody I think I want to share information with? At worst. At best, you're also giving them tools to empower them in the interview, to correct the interviewer, to answer open-ended questions. So there are so many payoffs. I think it's really foundational. I think it really does set the stage for a conversation. That can be more productive, can be more sensitive, can be more trauma-informed. Because, you know, nobody wants to walk into an interview and be asked as soon as they get in the room, tell me about your, you know, very traumatic, or maybe it wasn't traumatic, but very sensitive experience. There's some work done in 2014 by Greason and colleagues where they asked adolescents who were survivors of sexual assaults about their interactions in police interviews. And one of the messages that came through, their interactions were on the whole not that negative.
That's good.
But one of their comments was, I just wanted a little time to settle into that space before I had to share that information. And so I think those practices are trauma informed, and they convey the purpose of the interview. They set, you know, the roles so the child and the interviewer know what they're going to accomplish. So I think that my advice would be, you know, the payoff is so big, and the time doesn't have to be that long. It doesn't take that long to deliver ground rules or explain the room. You might be, you know, between 5 and 10 minutes in by the time you've done all of those things, including narrative practice. Now, having said that, you may have children who are really reluctant. You want to spend more time with them. Yes. And that's fine. But for a number of kids, they know what they're there to do. I also mentioned in the talk this morning that sometimes kids are prepared to come in and say, they know they have to come in and say, so-and-so touched me and I didn't like it. And that's, they've psyched themselves up to do that, but they're not ready to give a whole narrative about it. Yeah. And so although you may get the disclosure, you might not get all of that other contextual information, and then you have to sit there and ask a whole bunch of specific questions. Yeah. Right? Yes. Whereas if you spend that time up front, it feels like it takes longer, but it may pay off in terms of a richer narrative that you don't have to ask as many of those risky questions.
Right. I think, and can't remember if this was in one of your articles, but y'all talk about the downstream effects. And that was looking more at transition, but I think all of that comes before transition has downstream effects until later in the interview. Because if a child is comfortable and we've taken that time to settle them in and then just to give them that space, then maybe they would be more willing to talk with us and share all of the context, because it's not just enough for a child to say, something happened, someone touched my TT, but if we don't have a context about it, we don't have anything to work with at that point, really. Well, let me ask you, Sonja, and I guess we're getting time to wrap up, is that what would you say? Two final questions. One is, what's the direction of your future research? What ideas do you have for the rest of us, to benefit the rest of us for later?
Well, it's maybe a little bit of a difficult question, because right now we're working on something that I don't think will have immediate benefits. We recently got a grant to do some research on memory for repeated events, and that was one of my that was the research that I really started out doing in addition to preparatory phases. And so it's memory based. It's looking mainly at adults' memory for repeated events. So that's a big piece of what I'm doing right now. But in the background, we're continuing to do a lot of work on sort of supportiveness and how best to deliver supportive behaviors. We are still doing work in training. And I think that will have more translatable benefits in the short term, looking at the best ways to train interviewers, and also some of that ongoing, how can we keep up skills in the face of all of the other challenges, even when the initial learning is good and deep. There are still all of these organizational and various hurdles that you come across. So, things like more research around delivering peer review and supervision, and how is that best done. We did some work recently that was funded in Canada with Ontario Police Services, with Meredith Kirkland Burke and a detective sergeant in Ontario, and looking at how we could pilot a model, a sort of train the trainer model in-house, where we would develop specialist interviewers with high-level skills who would continue to have relationships with people like us and refresh their skills, but who could also monitor and supervise and conduct peer review in-house. And although there were some benefits of the project, and the people involved really liked being involved, we still saw a lot of those organizational barriers popping up, and we started with 12 specialists and we ended with 4 because people got moved and things like that. So, but that is an area that I am, on a few different fronts looking at that sustainability of training. I think that will be, of all of the things I'm doing right now, the most direct contribution.
Well, it's exciting to hear you say that, because I do think interviewers, they may be, I'm working with a girl now in our MCG group, and she, 2 years as an interviewer, well, the supervisor left, so now she's the supervisor. She's been interviewing 2 years. And doing the best that she can, but that is an organizational struggle because she doesn't have the support. She really doesn't have that knowledge yet, but she is absolutely doing the best that she can. And you just want to have more for those individuals. But the work with supervision, the work with peer review, and we need to convince our executive directors that just as it is important for our interviewers to go to training, they need the time for the supervision, for the peer review, for the self-review. So, well, I just can't tell you, Sonja, how much your work has changed the field, is changing the field, and is giving us guidance. And thank you for that. Thank you for being here.
And for having me.
I'm trying not to geek out, but just appreciate. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.